Hey everybody, we are live. Welcome to Pond's weekly webinar. The entire month of June, we have been doing these weekly sessions on Thursday. We have been covering all kinds of topics that especially the LGBT community has really been a lead on and shown the broader nonprofit sector a lot of great lessons to learn. And I can't think of a better topic to be wrapping that month up on than community. How to grow your community, engage them, and ultimately activate them. And we have just some incredible speakers on today to share about their experience and lessons learned. So I'm excited to get into all that. My name is Mitch Stein. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Pond. We throw events like this all the time to bring people together discussing top of mind topics in the sector. Pond is a platform where nonprofits thrive. We help connect you with the right resources. If you're looking for software, consultants, training, we have all of that in the marketplace for you to connect with, build up rewards along the way, so you save a bunch of money and time deciding on those things you need for your organization. So check out joinpond.com. But we are here today to learn from these pros. And so without further ado, I'd love to jump into introductions. And I'd love for folks to just share your name, what you do, and then if you don't mind, just a couple layers of your identity that are most important to you in this conversation today. So I will just go around that way. We'll start with Leah, if you don't mind.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me, Mitch. I so appreciate it. My name is Leah Simmons. I am the co-founder and CEO of Better Unite. We are a software ecosystem for nonprofit organizations to raise money, manage donors and members and volunteers and all of the things. Working to just make that a little bit more streamlined, a whole lot more streamlined and easier for nonprofit organizations. So I, as well, talk to a lot of nonprofits in my day-to-day experience. I am an entrepreneur, a bit of an unwitting entrepreneur. I'm actually a nonprofit empathizer. I've worked with nonprofits for a very long time, literally throughout my entire career. Before I was an art dealer, I worked in the arts world and worked with some arts-based nonprofits that led me to a career in nonprofit development and fundraising, which then led me to Better Unite. So I've got now a solution for a problem I have had throughout my career. And now, like I said, I'm sometimes a hesitant entrepreneur even. I'm also a mom of 5 kids, all told. I'm a lifelong yogi. I'm in long-term recovery from alcoholism as well. And so I speak to a lot of different communities that I know people on the call today will identify with as well. So thank you again for having me. I'm so happy to be here in such esteemed company as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Leah. Jonathan, you want to go next?
Of course. Greetings, everyone. My name is Jonathan Maher. I am the Director of Community Engagement for Villa of Hope. We are a comprehensive human service provider for people with mental health, substance use, and trauma needs in the Rochester, New York, and the greater Finger Lakes region of New York State specifically. And as the Director of Community Engagement, I oversee a lot of our grant writing, annual giving, communications, marketing, PR, advocacy, a whole bunch of stuff. As many nonprofit folks know, that the hats just keep growing and kind of building on that. So yeah, just literally recently, I think today, talking about more hats added to my job description. So it's like, great, that's awesome. So definitely can feel everyone with that. But and as a community engagement professional, I do a lot of fundraising, communications, building a lot of great ways to kind of focus on how to collectively listen to, respond, and engage our community to kind of meet the needs of the people we serve and meet our community. So, and I call myself a queer Latinx nonprofit strategist dedicated to addressing equity issues and building capacity, and a lot of other great kind of hats that I wear, as many of us do, just to think about, there's many ways for me to think about how we can effectively listen to and respond to our communities and how to best respond to that as well. So thanks for having me here.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jonathan. Denise, do you want to go next?
Absolutely. Thank you. And Jonathan, what you were saying made me think of the great baseball cap I just got from the pawn shop that says one of my many hats, I think. So yeah, it's It's a great hat. Hi, Denise Spivak. I am CEO of Centerlink. We are the Association of LGBTQ Community Centers with a membership focus primarily in North America, throughout the US and Canada, but also smattering throughout other countries as well. Been with the organization about 11 years, and we really focus on strengthening, supporting, and connecting LGBTQ community centers and their leaders across states, countries, bridges, whatever that might be. As for my identities, I'm a daughter, wife, grandmother, which was surprising since I never thought I'd have kids. And in my fourth career, a nonprofit consultant. So here I am, and thrilled to be hanging out with you, Mitch, and with my esteemed colleagues here. Thanks for inviting me.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Lisa. Kendrick, you mind going last?
Sure. Hey, everyone. And thank you, Mitch and Pon, for having me on. It's a nice way to finish a lot of conversations this month around LGBTQ nonprofits. So Kendrick Ross, my pronouns are he, him, his. I'm the executive director of Encapia, the National Queer Asian Pacific Islander Alliance, or National Queer API Alliance. We're trying to shorten this a little bit. I've been here about 16 months, so I am the second ED, but Encapia has been around for 17 years. Our work exists in, I would say, two large buckets. We resource and support LGBTQ API organizing at a very local level or an affinity-based level in about 15 states and 2 territories, everything around capacity building and policy education. And then at the federal level, we advance a pretty intersectional social justice agenda, representing and advocating for LGBTQ API folks and the shared communities in which we live. And then we do a lot of other fun stuffs, including galas, conventions, conferences, summits, and we do a lot of outreach to make sure that queer and trans API folks are included in research and data is disaggregated, and then resources are created that are culturally competent and reflective of queer and trans APIs, who are still a small community, but the fastest growing segment of LGBTQ America. So, and will be the largest segment of LGBTQ America by 2060. So we're doing a lot of prep work for that moment. In addition to all of that at Encapia, and yes, the thing about the hats resonates with me as well. We're actually hiring someone this week, and we've been going through job titles of like, well, you know, how many things can go under one job title for a small organization? But outside of my work in Encapia, I also identify as a Caribbean man, Indo-Caribbean, which is one of the newer API identities. I am an immigrant. Someone reminded me recently that it is Immigrant Heritage Month, so I need to uplift that as well. I am a new husband. Somebody reminded me of that as well. 6 months today. And I'm also a tennis player. So my home space is the LGBTQ community sports world. And it's a passion of mine to make sure that every queer and trans person, particularly those who have never seen themselves in sports, has access to affirming and welcoming sports spaces.
Amazing. Well, thank you everyone for those awesome intros. And we clearly are covering and touching an unbelievable amount of communities just within this one conversation. I will just say to the audience, I know Bonnie and Nathan already introduced themselves. Please, everybody jump in. If you have comments, we'll try to get to all of your questions or thoughts and make sure the group sees them. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about kind of the evolution of community here today. So I think it makes sense to start off just with definitions. Like, community is a term that gets thrown around all the time. And I'd love to hear from you all, like, how do you define community? How does that differ from audience? Like, you've got so many stakeholders as a nonprofit. When you're saying community, what do you really mean? And Denise, if you don't mind going first.
That's always such an interesting question for us, Mitch, because, our community is community centers, and that community We'd like to think of ourselves as a place where our community center leaders can find community. So that community to us has always meant a place where you can find a hand to pat you on the back when things go well and a shoulder to cry on when things are just absolutely tanking. A place that you can find advice and counsel and consolation. And so it's really the people that you are surrounded by and sometimes that you choose to surround yourself with. And I don't know that it necessarily has to have a geographical boundary, although sometimes it can.
Yeah, and Jonathan, because community is part of your actual official job title, I'd love for you, how do you think about the remit of community for your organization?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to really simplify, but like really, it's like anyone we really wanted to establish a relationship with. It could be in terms of the people we serve. It could be our workers, our staff, our volunteers, or people who potentially want to support and partner with us. So in kind of thinking about what really I'm hoping our efforts in is like we're thinking community engagement is a core part of our mission. I know sometimes it's usually like, oh, we got to do this and it's important to build community and doing that. But really thinking about like if we're true to our community and what they need and how to respond and build on that, we really need to ensure that it's core to our mission, our strategy, and building on that. So we really see it as an essential function of our part of our mission, like a program essentially is like, we got to build community, we got to respond to needs and build on that. And how can we effectively develop and strengthen relationships with many of our stakeholders that so we're building a space where everyone feels like they are welcomed, included, they belong, and they're feeling like they can benefit to accomplish either our mission or accomplish solving problems in their specific area.
Yeah, I love that definition of it being centered around relationships, where you have relationships or want to build them. And I also heard you say where everyone feels welcome, but I think there's times, like from a lot of what Kendrick was even saying in his intro, where it is really important to define and get specific about different identities and community. Kendrick, can you talk a little bit about, like, especially for historically marginalized groups, why it's important to create those really specific and potentially narrow spaces where they're specifically uplifted?
So absolutely, that's been the crux of the last 16 months at Encopia, to define who I use the word constituency often because I use the word communities. And one of the things we've done is when we speak about identities within the API world, we want to use the word communities because we're trying to dismantle systems and identities that erase smaller and more marginalized groups. So in saying there's a queer and trans API community, we run the risk of further marginalizing folks because, as we know, when somebody thinks of the stereotypical Asian person, they may not think of me. And they may not think of probably half of API Americans. So particularly Pacifica folks, Black Asians, Muslims, for example, they don't necessarily fit. So we have been kind of like threading the needle of saying, this is the constituencies that we want to represent. And at the same time, leaving space to say, this is a very, very, very diverse spectrum of identities. And the way we've been doing that is to say, we're not going to come up with one agenda that unites basically descendants of 60% of the world's population. But we are going to put resources into grassroots organizing in very many of those communities. And it's been a transition for us to one, really expand the notion that we are many communities within one constituency, which is API, and at the same time, expand Encopia's notion that we are, because we are the only national organization, every queer and trans API person should look to us as a home space. And during the pandemic, that became very evident. People who'd never heard of Encopia before reached out, asked, what is your position on this? What is your position on that? And gave money. because they felt this was the organization that was theirs. So my goal is, one, to resource the idea that there are many communities and they need resources. At the same time, make sure that we are a home for everybody who identifies as us.
And I think you just raised a great point in being specific with the identity of the community, how that drew funds to you, right? Because you've made it very clear that specific mission you're serving. And I think that community definition is a big part of it. Leah, I'd love to hear from you around the community as people think about engaging and defining. You mentioned within your system, you manage volunteers, attendees, donors, people in your, like, there's all these kind of layers of who your audience looks like. Like, how do you think when you hear the words community engagement or defining your community, how do you think about it across those different components of nonprofit stakeholders?
Yeah, I think it can go straight to what Kendrick was mentioning as well, that within any one community, there are multiple communities and multiple identities. And so we always say, like, within, and this is just a very small example, but within Better Unite, the sign up page is having it built into what is typically a fundraising or donor management tool. Having the volunteer tool built in means that I'm able to offer my donors the opportunity to volunteer and the volunteers the opportunity to donate, because so often, as we all know in nonprofit world, one is the other. So being able to, kind of cross-pollinate in that way within a software system is cool, but it does speak to that interplay that I think is so common among within nonprofits, within any one particular nonprofit as well.
Yeah, and the single biggest question, I get this all the time, I'm sure all of you hear this all the time, is like, well, we just need to grow. We need more donors, we need more volunteers. Like, growth seems to be everyone's first priority. And so maybe a trite question, but I'd love to hear just if folks have tips on, like, how do you grow your community? Like, what are some of the steps you take when you think about growing that donor list or newsletter subscriber or event attendees, and how to make sure you're seeing that top line growth? Jonathan, if you don't mind taking that one first.
Sure. I kind of think of it as multi-way. I mean, I definitely think, first of all, there's so many different types of people and identities. So I like Kendrick's comment of really defining who you really want to build a relationship and cultivate and specifically naming it. We don't have to cultivate everyone and engage everyone, and not everyone would want to cultivate and engage with us too. I think it's just accepting that. I think we're all awesome and great, and all our missions are amazing, but not everyone is going to have the time, interest, and capacity to develop that. So really defining what that looks like for your team or your agency or focus, to say, these are the communities that we want to listen to and really respond, and how do they want to then collectively engage with us? I think also thinking about, we might think of our standard just like, oh, well, we need a bigger email list. We need more Facebook followers. We need more people at our events, but kind of listening to how people want to respond and engage to us so that we know what types of relationships we want to develop with. Not everyone wants to attend in-person events anymore. Not everyone wants to get a million emails from you and kind of look at that. How can you then, effectively listen to how they want to engage with your organization and then respond to kind of build on that, given your capacity and strength. And I think that will kind of lead towards more effective, more organic, natural, and sustainable growth, because you're not kind of stretching yourself just to think about what that is. And I think also, what the beauty of community engagement, what I love is, trying things out and responding, and then evaluating your efforts to figure out how they go. If something works, great, keep it going or edit it. If it doesn't, and being okay with change. I think change is the main constant everyone's navigating, and how we can effectively ensure that. But how can you really, think about how your community, what types of relationships they want to establish with you, and what does that look like, and effectively build that so you build more trust and you build more champions.
And Kendrick, I know you've mentioned how much growth you've even seen over the course of the pandemic. I'd love to hear what's worked well. What have you found to be most effective in bringing that right audience to the table?
So Unfortunate circumstances during the last 2 years has drawn a lot of people to Encapia for the first time. Not just the roller coaster of the pandemic, but also the spike in anti-Asian violence. So a lot of folks were looking for a space and a home, or at least some level of advocacy that named them. And we are the Gaysians at the LGBTQ table and the API national tables. We are usually the smallest voice, but we are that voice. So I think a lot of folks found us for the first time, and they found us in many ways. And I'm a big proponent of technology, although I'm very bad at it, of the ways that people connect. Certainly not necessarily the Twitters of the world, but fundraising software, outreach software. A lot of folks found Encapia for the first time through things like Benevity, that their companies launched these small campaigns around combating anti-Asian violence. But something significant that we have done over the last 16 months is to change our mission statement. And the old Encapia read, "We are a federation of." The new statement reads, "We empower LGBTQ Asians and Pacific Islanders." It centers individuals, not groups, because the vast majority, 90% of queer and trans Asians and Pacific folks in the country will never be part of one of our groups. And for a very long time, for most of our history, they were excluded from our events, from our conferences. You had to be a member of a member group. That is not really representing our community. So while we continue to intensely and intentionally resource the groups on the ground, we want to be a space for every queer and trans API person. And I feel that changing that framing has made it much easier to go to people and say, look, this is a home space for you. And it also presents a challenge that when your constituencies are broader, you have to be a little bit more nuanced in your thinking. So this is something, and I speak on more and more as we are in this position right now where queer and trans people are at such danger, that our movement elites have to be much more nuanced and complex in how they say they represent communities. And part of that is actually listening to communities, not just fellow elites. And part of that is really plain language. And something else we've done at Encapia is to break down issues in ways that the non-social justice warrior can understand and grasp.
Yeah, I think that language is so important, and I'm really glad you brought that up, Kendrick. I appreciate that. And Denise, since you sit and get to observe and engage with hundreds of organizational leaders, I don't know if you have some examples top of mind of folks that you've seen do a really amazing job of growing their audience and what's worked for them.
Yeah, I'm amazed by the organizations that I work with and we partner with every day, and how they continue to learn and grow from their communities. And I think, so much of what Jonathan and Kendrick have already said, and I'll go to the partnerships as well. I think it's really, aligning yourself with the right partners to help further their mission and yours. I think that collaborative approach to community is always going to be so much more impactful than trying to just focus only on your mission, your growth, your right. It's got to be that, and some of that takes a little humility and willingness to not be the one, right? And I think for a lot of our centers, there was, and for Centerlink too, I got to be honest, there was that period of, we're going to be the organization that is about centers, and then the center is going to be the community organization, and it's taking that step back to realize that that the partnership, the collaboration, and also the outreach and how we're doing that. Are we speaking to people literally in their language, right? Are we doing our marketing materials in multiple languages to reach multiple communities are we representing in our marketing? People, as Kendrick was talking about, like seeing themselves in the organization. And I think a lot of our centers have gone through those transformations and seen the rewards of that for the community and for their organization.
Awesome. Thanks, Denise. And Leah, I know everyone's kind of touched on this topic as well about how you don't just want more audience or more community members. You want the right folks. You want mission aligned folks. Is there anything that you've seen work really well to make sure that like the organization is being authentic and getting the right kind of audience that's growing their community?
The thing that I see occur the most often with the most success is, and I mean, it's a trite something that we hear all the time, but like data-driven fundraising. But I would also say data-driven connecting, right? Where we want to build relationships. And in enterprise world, we talk about, KYC, know your customer. Well, same thing, right? We need to know the people that we engage with and that we're already engaged with, those key stakeholders, and the groups that we're reaching out to and speaking to, listening to them. I hear, so we have this wonderful event tool, and nonprofits will ask me, how should I do this event, or where should I set the giving levels, right? That's a really common question. And there is no way for me, coming from software world and not really knowing your organization and your donors, for me to realistically tell you that. Sure, I can tell you things, and I can tell you what I kind of see often, but I always kind of push back to the organization to say, you're the one that knows your donor, or Kendrick, we have a tenuous relationship with tech, right? That's very, very common. And, am I going to be able to do my silent auction exclusively online this year for the first time? COVID, one of the small silver linings in it, really helped us out with that, and that we were all forced online for a bit. But it may be true that you have a demographic that maybe doesn't have access to Wi-Fi or doesn't have access to cell phones, or what type of event are you throwing? So I think that the organizations that have the most success bringing in new people are the ones that really know the people they have very well.
Yeah, and now that we spent a bunch of time on this growth kind of like top line number, I'd love to spend probably even more time digging in on, okay, we all sort of have established communities and hopefully they're growing, but how do we make sure we're engaging in the appropriate and best way? Jonathan, I'd love to hear how, as you mentioned, a lot of things you try and things are on your plate that you work on, but how do you measure success of that to be able to reflect and say this worked or didn't work or want to do more of that?
Yeah, that's a good thing, because as you mentioned, you're doing so much, you have to kind of prioritize given your certain capacity and efforts. And I think setting some goals and metrics helps you really focus on like, what should we actually be doing? Because as someone who wears many hats and tries to be an overachiever, I want to do it all, but I have to focus on what we're kind of tailored on and what our goals are too. And I think it goes to like, what are the types of goals that you're kind of hoping for? Are you hoping to just build awareness? Are you hoping to engage? And excuse, my cat just, of course, showed up right at the time that I tried to speak. So this is Theo. He loves attention. So just ignore him at the time. Focus on your goals, and then what metrics make sense to kind of measure towards those goals. Are you building awareness? Are you wanting people to take action for you? Are you wanting people to donate? And then try to tailor as much as they can for that. To figure out what that looks like. And as I'm a small shop at a somewhat large agency, but it's really trying to figure out efficient tools to kind of help measure what that looks like. So we're not just like sending out an email and then tracking the campaign somewhere else, or we're sending actions in a way that we can easily track and engage and effectively work on what that looks like. And I also think, we discredit sometimes the opportunity to just collect like tangible qualitative feedback, like we just need to talk to people and listen to say like, what's your feedback? What's your engagement? Especially prioritizing and centering those voices that sometimes don't get heard as much, like focusing on those communities, because then those if you center the most vulnerable and the most traditionally excluded, you're going to benefit everyone. So going to those people and asking them for direct feedback, like, how can I build on this? How can I empower this and focus on what that looks like? And then, taking that and considering how you then adjust your strategies on building that as well. So, it's definitely focus on what you actually want to measure, and then is it going to measure towards the goals that you want, and then really centering the voices that you want at top of mind with it, so that you're listening and responding to their needs too, and prioritizing that as well.
Yeah, and you just brought up something really important, which is being thoughtful about how you're engaging and who you're engaging with. And I think there's a huge DEIB lens to community engagement. Kendrick, I'd love to hear if you have any tips, just as I know you have a really specific focus on certain identities, how you try to be mindful to make sure your engagement is inclusive and recognizing the audience you're working with, and maybe some tips other folks could think about when they think about engaging their communities.
Yeah, I mean, it's always on my mind because I come from one of the less represented API identities. So it's always top of mind that there are levels of marginalization, even in marginalized spaces. So one way that we have done that is to talk about communities, is to go out and be intentional about finding stakeholders, grassroots groups in parts of the country, in communities where there's not been investment and support. And how can Incapia do that? We're launching several fellowship programs to say, you have an interesting idea for your community in Arkansas. How can we provide you with tools? So that's one, actually going out intentionally finding the folks that you know are there, because we also have this idea that, well, we're broadening the community. We're not necessarily doing that. We're just becoming more reflective of the people who are already in the room, in those corners that we've pushed them towards. And to not just make blanket statements like, yes, our strongest Pacifica groups are in the Pacific Northwest, because there are large Pacifica communities there and in the West Coast, but also how we're investing in queer and trans Pacific Islander communities in the South, where they are rapidly growing in Texas, Arkansas, and Florida. Those are great, to me, exciting opportunities to do something a little bit different and put tools in people's hands. And then the partnerships, going back to what Denise was saying, that part of our role, in addition to going internally into our community, is to make sure that our partners have tools that they would need to make spaces for us. So, I would love for API programming to be at every community center across the country. Actually, Denise, I was going to talk to you about this one right now. The LGBTQ Center in New York City had for a long time a complicated relationship with BIPOC communities and API communities. During in April, I went to the queer iftar at the center. It was a transformative change to walk into a space that was so community centered, and queer Muslims felt at home here. That it became the center in New York City for a queer and trans iftar. How do we do that across the country? How do we do that in the equality groups? So I'm going to the Equality Federation conference. If not us, then who? If we are going to represent the communities that we say we're going to represent, we have to do the work of providing these tools, of saying, we have access to the experts, we have access to the lived experience, let us help you. And sometimes too often we're in the space of let us critique you. And that does nobody any good. So let us help you.
I love that. It's such an important reminder. And you brought up one of these, a reality of LGBT community is just how expansive and kind of ever growing that is, and complex in terms of identities. Denise, how do you think I have a similar question to Kendrick, because I'd just love to hear your perspective more broadly across community centers, is like, how have you seen people be intentional in how they engage community while keeping diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging in mind?
It's it is an ongoing process, and I'm not going to say that all of our centers have been able to go out there and have an easy time engaging community. I think Kendrick brought up some really strong points about centers. There are centers that have had challenging relationships, whether it's with the trans community or with the Muslim community or the Jewish community. I mean, there've been a lot of centers that have had those external struggles and also internal struggles. We've seen centers that have hired leaders of color, but the board was in no way prepared to welcome and nurture that leader of color. And so that person's term was very short. And so what I think centers are starting to do more is, and have been for the past few years, is make a concerted effort to look at how they are approaching marginalized communities within our larger marginalized community, and who is not being included, right, in their center, who needs, where does the outreach need to be, and how does that outreach need to be done, so that it's not tokenizing. I mean, that's one of the things that I think has happened in the past, whether it's with centers or other organizations. So we're working on the backside with boards and staff to do that education, to bring in consultants to do that education, so that our community center staff and board are representing and reflecting the communities that they serve, and that those communities are coming to the center and feeling welcome and feeling represented and able to feel a part of that broader community.
Yeah, thank you for those examples, Denise, too. And there was one question in the chat I just wanted to clarify. Justin, it's a B. Sorry for not being eloquent enough there, but it's a B for belonging, in addition to diversity, equity, and inclusion. While we're talking about engagement, Leah, I would love to hear if you have any examples or stuff you've seen when folks maybe have struggled, like they're like, yeah, we have a long donor list, or we've got this long email list, but we're struggling to get them at our events, or we need something fresh. Like, how do we get folks engaged? What are some things that you've seen work really well?
What I see work well is leaning into different modalities, right? Like, instead of, the kind of the same event over and over again, being open to change, being open to a brand new idea for whether it's a fundraiser, or maybe it's a membership drive, or it's a peer-to-peer fundraiser where you're, going to engage people. I mean, those can also be walk, run, race. There's all kinds of variations of that. Bowl-a-thons, right? Anything that can bring people together for free or for nominal donations, or give what you can kind of things, that can, that really do foster engagement. Because, and what good timing on DEIB and belonging, because I think community is really all connection, right? Like, it's that craving for connection that we have. So, and just like Denise was just speaking to, how do we cultivate connection to any one, even more marginalized group, and then let it spread from there. And that's usually going to be, I think, kind of thinking outside of the box. So we saw, a decent amount of this, right, during COVID, which came from a financial need, right? We had to look, and we were restricted by where we could go. But my sincere hope is that grows into a more an openness in our generation that lives with COVID, that's experienced the pandemic, right? That we all become a bit more adaptable and amenable to, okay, let's look at a different way to approach this. And I know you've asked me for a specific example. The truth is, like I said, during COVID, I saw every group do this. I saw every organization, my own company, we'd been talking about a virtual event tool, kind of, hey, maybe what wouldn't it be cool if, and then all of a sudden, super fast track through a month of intense development, and there it was. So I'm sure everybody learned so much through all of that. So I'm sorry, I'm not thinking of a very good immediate example, but again, everyone did it to incredible success, really, during COVID as well.
Yeah, I mean, no, you bring up a great point about holding on to that, innovation that we had around the pandemic in just about every organization. Now, at the time, I heard of a lot of people about 6 months in complaining about innovation fatigue. It's like, all right, we have to rethink everything again and do it again. So I know we don't want to be in that space that's so draining, but hanging on to that spirit of we got to try something, let's put something out there, see how it goes, and being really agile, I think is something that we can all hang on to.
Another thing I was thinking through as well too, I mean, I think everyone kind of touched on this just in speaking to their, their community partners and the marginalized folks and anybody within the community, is the willingness to go forward and talk to them, right? In nuanced yet plain spoken, whatever language it is, however you're communicating with them. And I was thinking about, we see these Survey Monkey emails go out all the time, or there are surveys of every type and typology. And I typically, I don't know about you all, but I skip right past those. I'm not interested in that. And so I do think that I have seen a couple of organizations. Austin Recovery Network is one that I've worked with myself personally, and they did, I think, a really good job of, rather than just sending out these surveys, actually having conversations. So while, of course, I come here from the tech side of things, I would encourage the real conversations to ask questions and listen for that nuance that you might not get from a survey set of answers. Last thought that I had on that.
I mean, I'd love to add on that too, Leah. 'Cause there's an awesome book which we'll put in our summary called The Mom Test, and we talk about it a lot in startup world, where it's like if you think you have a great startup idea, you don't just go to your mom and say, "Hey, here's my great idea. What do you think?" Because she's going to say like, "Yeah, that sounds great, sweetie." And if you really want real feedback, it's actually better to start just learning from the person. And I think that's what you just brought up, the conversations you're having with your community around events. It's actually better, instead of just being like, okay, what'd you think about our gala, or what'd you think about the bowl-a-thon, to actually learn more about, like, well, did you connect with, ask specific questions? Did you feel like you met new people? Did you feel, have you been wanting to get more engaged with the organization? What's been missing in your community? And start general before you get specific. But there's a ton of great examples in that book, so I'll definitely share it. One thing, Jonathan, since you brought up how many hats, which we continue to make that joke, and it's why Pond made hats that say one of my many hats, like Denise mentioned, that are for sale and benefiting Centerlink, if folks want to check that out. But Jonathan, I'd love to hear where you found success in bringing the community in to help share some of the bandwidth load of community management. Like, do you find success in, I don't know if it's just giving more responsibility to certain community members, or kind of like staffing people to help get the word out? Like Leah brought up peer-to-peer fundraising. I don't know if you have any examples of where that's been helpful.
Yeah, that's a good thing. And, leveraging your community for the sake of your goals is a great engagement tool and a great building capacity tool as well. I've seen it in different ways. Like, I think it just depends on kind of the types of relationships people want, specifically in what you can have. But like, I think navigating and being a good change manager is like the most important hat I had, because all of this has changed for most people. So if you can get them comfortable with navigating the change, I think that's one of the most important hats I have to use the most, of just getting them comfortable with that. And then, and then I think it's like I outline, what your goals are, what tasks are needed, and how you can engage people in different ways. So, for example, we're starting a new advocacy group for our staff. So our staff can feel like they can have a voice, especially to our elected officials, so that we're advocating for issues, because a lot of our challenges have been related to kind of state regulation. So if we do add more advocacy, we can kind of advocate for that as well. But realizing, like, what's the capacity for people to really engage effectively in this, and what does that look like? So maybe it's like organizing most of it so that they're just a one month, and they'd be like, oh, I can do this, and work on that as well. Or restructuring how we think about meetings and types of engagement points too. Sometimes we're just like, oh, let's have a monthly meeting and organize it. But is there a better way to structure things so that it's effective cultivation? through it as well. So I know like we've had a council that we're rethinking to instead of monthly meetings, do quarterly summits so that there might be a little bit longer, but then their feedback, engagement points, and people can dedicate their time as well. But I think it's also, as a social worker is also one of the many hats I wear as well. And being a strengths focused type way, like what are the strengths of the community you're engaging and how can you leverage those strengths to build on them for them, but also accomplish what it is. So if it's engaging digitally, if it's utilizing in-person type of opportunities, I think it's like, building that feedback and conversations with them to understand where that is and then how you can fit that in to kind of your grand scope of how to leverage specifically as well. So it's again, a combination of things, but I think focusing on what do people bring to the table and what do they want to bring to the table? And then how can you fit that into the many hats and strategies you have in place?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of what you just said brought up for me was that little upfront investment of making sure the goals are super clear, people are on the same page, and that you're spending a little bit of that time upfront can pay a lot of dividends as you go. Mm-hmm. And I think what we've touched on a little bit, but I'd love to hit on more head on is just aside from engagement, like activation. So you mentioned advocacy. So if the ultimate outcome of this community is they're going to be, driving signatures on a petition or votes at the polls, or is it donating? How do you think about the right time or frequency to make asks of your community? And Kendrick, I know you brought this up of the spike in anti-API hate that's been happening the last 2 years. Also balancing that with not like, I don't know the term, but sort of like taking advantage of one of those tender moments to be asking for money. Like, how do you think about that balance of you're striking when the iron's hot, if people are paying attention, but not stepping too far?
It's a delicate balance, and sometimes we're doing things a little bit differently at Encopiad, and I think for some of our movement spaces, and until we expand our team more, it's kind of, I wouldn't say my preferences, but 25 years of seeing these things done, I am like, well, how can we do this a little bit better? And for example, on Friday, Encopiad did not send out an email around what happened to the Supreme Court because everybody else did. And it is important, but it would get lost. And I feel part of the issue right now around engaging folks is having conversations. And if you are engaging people 2 minutes after something happens, they're just inundated with posts and comments and emails. So, we tend to do engagement a little bit different. Today is Give Out Day. We're not doing a campaign around Give Out Day, but we will do a more sustainable campaign to tell Encopiad's story over the summer. And I think that's where we want to be, not because there's anything wrong with doing it, but much bigger players are in that space today. We're not going to be able to break through. So let's break through in the ways that work for us. But there is a delicate balance, particularly when you're working with marginalized communities, and so much right now is negative. So much is harmful. That's like, I don't know what to highlight that is like a positive on a day in, day out basis. But I will say having the more nuanced conversations, showing the work that has to be done, and then inviting folks in. So I think that's our balancing strategy.
Yeah, I mean, you brought up a lot of where this just gets hard and you're making hard decisions and hard judgment calls of where and when to engage. We just had a comment come up in the chat. Denise, I don't know if you might have some thoughts on this, but like, what about when conflict happens in your community? And how do you things get political or people get fired up, and especially with social media, you see this a lot. How do you think about your organization or your personal role in kind of mediating that and keeping the community together when there is conflict?
Yeah, and a lot of our centers have gone through this, honestly, and it's really, I go back to what Kendrick just said, right? It's knowing when you need to have your voice present, and a lot of times our advice to a center is don't reply, don't respond, it's like if you do that, you're going to fuel the negativity rather than letting something that's going to blow over in 2 days blow over and getting on with the important business that you're doing. So I was saying amen back here. If my mic had been open, you would have heard it, to so much of what Kendrick was saying. You know, the flood of emails that came out on Friday, I was shocked at how many of them had an ask for money. That honestly, it was just, as a person just receiving the email, right? I'm sitting there going, oh my God, this is so misplaced. Like, but I've seen organizations that will ask for money no matter what, you know? I mean, it's like, oh my God, the sky's blue today, give to us. Oh my gosh, you know, this terrible thing happened, give to us. And it's, so I think it's knowing your audience, understanding what's going to be effective when your voice needs to be out there, and when it's either going to be lost in a flood of other voices, or it's really going to do more either harm or just be considered ineffective or useless. And I think our centers are doing a really good job of having those conversations with the community, listening to the feedback, and gauging what's going to be productive and what's just going to be either excess or negative.
Yeah, I think you made. Oh, go ahead, Kendrick.
You know, ditto to everything Denise said, and I think this is important for a lot of us. The non-response. Many times, if somebody's going to attack you on Twitter or Facebook or something like that, they're not necessarily looking for dialogue. They're looking for a moment of exhaling their opinion. And I think it is very important not to get into the back and forth, which can be damaging on an individual level, but more importantly on an organizational level as well. And I've seen entire organizations collapse over this.
Yeah, and I was just going to mention that Denise brought up two really good, I think, practical decision points when this stuff comes up. Is like, number one, do we need to say anything at all? And all those considerations you brought up. And number two, is this the right time to be asking for money? And just being really thoughtful about that. Leah, how, like, do you give advice, or like, how often is too much to be asking for something of your community? Is there like a right cadence, or how you advise people around when to make the ask for donations?
I mean, absolutely. Just to what Denise and Kendrick have been talking about, there is definitely a wrong time to be asking for money. I think that there's a lot of value in having, you know, kind of passive fundraising opportunities out there always, right? A good solid donate now button and membership or recurring giving opportunities are always helpful and are sustainability, you know, fueling essentially. I personally, again, this would be more from my own nonprofit experience. I think, you know, the house being on fire is not a good or compelling ask. You know, people like to give to things that, just like all of us, right, that are stable, that are going to do what we are hoping it's going to do. And when it feels like it's falling apart, that is a really tough place to be in, to be asking for, you know, sustaining funding. So the more that can be avoided, the better. And gap funding, you know, those kinds of things, those exist, and sometimes they're really necessary. But I think even staying away from language like that, by having a good solid plan in the first place, by knowing that this is going to be a piece of what you do, you know, development is, like it or not, a piece of the nonprofit ecosystem and the part of the sector that we're all in, and frankly is such a necessary pillar of the society that we all enjoy, just the way that things have worked out. We need to go into any year, any fundraising or any nonprofit endeavor with that in mind and with a solid plan for it. So you know, again, I think that agree absolutely that there's a wrong time to ask around negativity, and then there's sometimes though it's right. Don't get me wrong, but that there's a real need to have a more a plan and an action plan in place, that you're not kind of being responsive, right? That you're able to use that pause to say, okay, now let's build a case and let's go about this mindfully.
And one of those like wrong time, right time to ask things that I'd love to hear from you, Jonathan, is when it comes to maybe folks that are receiving your services as an agency or your volunteers that are already giving time, how do you have like a rule of thumb on when it's okay to ask beneficiaries or clients and to support, or do you just avoid it entirely? Like, how do you strike that balance?
I mean, it's depends on it. I mean, with the communities you have the best relationship with, you kind of know when to best ask, because you know, like when they trust you, they understand when things are going, so you know, like either there's a certain time of the year or a specific type of way they like to respond. So that's kind of why, you know, collecting data and developing that feedback so that you know, like this is the best time to ask, and kind of work on that as well. I think it's also a mix of then, you know, thinking about mass audiences that you're developing relationships with, is how can you strategize around thinking about just all the types of communications and pipelines you have, and how often are you asking, or how are you doing it as well. I also like to think about your like think to ask ratio, like how often are you thanking people, just generally like grateful for their support, you know, compared to the amount of time you're asking. So, you know, I try to always up that thanking ask and engaging a whole wide of different stakeholders in that process, so they feel like, you know, it's grateful and generative, and then before thinking about the next ask as well. Or, you know, making sure that you're ensuring the content's there. And maybe it's like making sure the opportunity is known, that there is an opportunity for an ask, but not necessarily giving that direct ask. Sometimes some of the best types of engagement points have been like an indirect type of way to get support as well. It like you just gave a really great newsletter, or we posted a great I've gotten great gifts from like one good social media post that like had just been out there that didn't have an ask, that just was like, this is the impact that something can have as well. So, you know, I think it's then tying that in while you're then developing the relationship, so you know the best way to kind of ask and build on it. So you know, it's a mix of trial and figuring out what works for the agents, you know, the community you're working on, then the audience, and then as you then know about it, then strategizing. You know, I like to create a yearly calendar of things to just organize myself and when to prioritize what makes sense within my community, to then know when the best time is to organize my efforts.
Mitch, I was going to. Yeah, I know we're coming close to the end, but Sonia had asked a question, and you know, in Leah and Jonathan's responses, they mentioned a word that I think is so important, and that's plan. So one is like a development plan and a development communications plan, but the other thing is, you know, as you go into an event, as you have an organization, having that communications plan, having that crisis communications plan, having that point of contact, who's going to be the person talking, who's going to be the person mediating if things blow up. Having that in advance, that sort of risk management, if you will, is so essential for an organization, and keeping that communication with your community stable and consistent. I think that's vital for an organization. So I wanted to throw that in.
Yeah, I mean, community is your biggest asset, I think, for most nonprofits, and you would risk plan around any asset, you know, if it was threatened. And I think having some sort of plan around those risks for anything that come up makes a ton of sense. So thank you so much for sharing that, Denise. We are like right up here on the end. I had a couple more questions I wanted to ask, but I don't want to hold people over. I am just so grateful for everyone. I think right now is just a time where community, we all can appreciate. I think someone said along the way how it's that needing to be connected and belonging with others. So we just recognizing where we have community, investing in it is, I just think, the best thing we can do for each other right now. So I'm super grateful for all of you for joining us and sharing so much insight. We will put a summary together and post that on Pon's blog and share it on LinkedIn for everybody. And don't forget, if you're on Pond, you join this session, be sure to fill out our survey at the end and you'll get some added credit to your account. And be sure to come back to Pond for any needs you have for your organization. So thank you so much for everyone for joining, and we will see you back here soon.